Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thanks very much for everyone for giving me this opportunity to talk a little bit about some things I've been working on recently. So the topic I'm going to talk about I've titled as Exploring Text Reuse in the Pre-Chin and Han corpus.
Tom,
So,
can you put the mic up closer to your,
Can you
your collar?
turn it on? Is that better?
Yes.
Great. The topic, exploring text reuse in the pre-Chin and Han corpus, might seem superficially to be very different from the things we've heard about so far today, but in fact it's quite closely related in some senses, because whereas we've been hearing a lot about relationships between people, relationships between places and so on, these other objects, in fact what I'm going to talk about today is also relational. So relations not between people, but instead between texts and different pieces of writing. So this is just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about text reuse on the micro level, so on individual instances of text reuse or parallel passages. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, but I'll explain in a minute what I mean by them. So how do we identify these and visualize these? And then I'm going to try and take a step back and take a more general look at the overall picture that you get when you look at text reuse on a corpus level, so throughout the set of pre-Chin and Han texts. And how do we quantify text reuse on that level, and how can we visualize it? So just to give a bit of background, parallel passages or text reuse is maybe an ambiguous term or can mean various different things to different people. What I mean today, the kind of text reuse I'm talking about is fairly blatant text reuse. So passages that on the basis of just the surface structure and the surface content seem to share some kind of causal history rather than being plausibly the product of two completely independent authors who haven't seen the same piece of text or heard the same story told in the same words. So in particular, I'm not thinking of subtle allusion, which is another kind of text reuse that we might want to study. But at the same time, I'm not talking just about identical reuse, so different parallel passages that appear in different places very often involve minor differences within the context of a broader similarity. So often they have interpolation or omission. And very often it's these differences that are actually the interesting things about the parallels. So parallels in this sense can be automatically identified on a computer by a fuzzy search method. I'm not going to go into the details of that because of time, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. And the pre-Chin and Han corpus, I'm thinking just of transmitted texts from that period of time, which are known to contain in many places very extensive parallels, both within the same text and with other texts. And this is often related to complex textual histories of these texts, where they're often not the product of a single author, but more of a compilation and the result of an editing process that spans, in many cases, many centuries. So just to give a very simple example of the kind of thing that I'm calling a parallel passage, there's this line which appears in the Lunyu, and then which appears again in this Shiji in an almost identical form, but not quite identical, as you can see by putting the two passages side by side. Although the second half is identical, and these are very clearly, in some sense, the same passage, there are also localized differences within those. So people have been interested in parallel passages of this sort for quite a while, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong have actually published for a few pre-Chin and Han texts comprehensive concordances, comprehensive books which attempt to list all the occurrences of text reuse between one specific pre-Chin and Han text and the rest of the pre-Chin and Han corpus. So what we have here is just one page from a typical book, where this is the list of parallel passages in the Xinshu, and at the top we have one passage cited from the text in question, the Xinshu, and then below it we have listed exhaustively all the parallels throughout the corpus to that passage, which in this case includes two passages from the Shiji, both of which are clearly very similar, although not identical, in fact, if you look closely to one another, and also not identical to the passage from the Xinshu. So this kind of representation is very helpful if you're interested in parallel passages and have the time to look through them in detail. So it records the data, it omits some data because of space considerations, but even so it takes up a lot of space. So if we extrapolate from one book, the book for the Xinshu, for example, is over 230 pages. If you wanted to produce this for the whole set of pre-Chin and Han texts, it would result in well over 30,000 pages, which is really an impractically long amount of text. And a second issue with it is that it's actually quite difficult to see exactly where the differences are within these longer passages. You really have to look through them quite carefully in parallel to see what's actually changed in each version. So what I want to look at first is how we can visualize these on an electronic system. So there are a couple of issues that we'd have to deal with that. And the first is that parallels between these texts are not always as simple as the examples I've shown so far. So they can in fact not be parallels to entire sentences or entire paragraphs, but to arbitrary chunks of sentences. And they can overlap in very strange ways, and they frequently do because there are so many parallels within the preaching and hand corpus. So I think there are two kinds of questions that we can try and address visually. The first of which is, given some passage, which parts of it appear elsewhere and where do they appear? And secondly, how do these different versions in different places differ? So what I've come up with for this is a two-stage interactive visualization, and this is available online. I'll give the web address at the end of the presentation. But the first stage of it displays in a heat map format the passage that's under consideration. So if you imagine the example from the Shinshu before, you go to one passage from the Shinshu or this passage here from the Zhuangzi, and on top of that, you get this heat map visualization which indicates in successively darker shades of red successively more overlapping groups of parallels. So what you can see from this in this example is that in fact for this passage there are parallels to all parts of this passage in at least one place. So all of these characters are overlaid in shades of red. But in some cases, for example, this line here, 子公户有道也, this part appears in a greater number of places. And it's interactive in the sense that if you move the mouse cursor over a particular passage, a particular part of the passage on the online system, it will then list all the places where that part of the passage appears in a parallel. And clicking on it will then take you down to the second stage of the visualization, which lists precisely what the individual cases are, and also attempts to highlight where the differences are within those, which I'll explain a little on the next slide. So the idea behind this is pretty straightforward in principle, just to draw attention to where the differences are. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but if you sort of play around with the online system, it'll be quite intuitive, I think. The idea is that you highlight one, or you nominate one version of the passage that you're interested in. So in this case, the version marked with an X, the passage from the Zhuangzi. And then within that version, the system will automatically highlight all those characters within that particular version, which are either omitted from or appear differently in any one of the other versions with which it's being compared. And for the remaining version, so in this case the two passages from the Huainanzi, you get the reverse thing. Any character in that version which is not appearing in the highlighted selected version, or which appears differently in the nominated version, is then highlighted in a second color. So the purpose of this is really to give you an at-a-glance feeling of where the changes are when you go from one version to the other. And that becomes quite useful when you look at longer passages like this, where without any visual highlighting, you really need to look at this quite carefully to see where the differences are. But with the highlighting, it becomes pretty easy to see at a glance. So I now want to move on a little to talk about the bigger picture. So how we look at trends in text reuse across the corpus. And to do that, the first thing we really need to have is some way of quantifying text reuse at the level of a text. So the first naive way that we might try to do this would be just by counting reuse instances or counting the numbers of parallels that occurs. This makes some sort of sense for some cases, and it would make sense in the easy cases where there's relatively little text reuse within a particular text. But the big problem with counting things this way is that in many preaching and hand texts, texts have parallels, similarities within them as well as to other texts. And if you count text simply as reuse instances, then in these cases where you're comparing two texts, both of which have the same passage effectively repeated over and over, the number of instances increases in a quadratic fashion. So you end up overcounting effectively. So instead of that, what I'm using to quantify text reuse in what follows is what I'm describing as a painting method, which is actually pretty easy to understand. The idea is that we want to count what proportion of a text has some parallel with some other text which we're comparing it with, or with the entire corpus if that's what we're comparing it with. And I call this the painting method because a very easy way to understand it is just to imagine you have a printed copy of the text which you're interested in, and you start at the beginning, and for every character, if that character belongs to a parallel with some other text you're comparing it with, you draw a red line under it, and then at the end of the day, when you've got to the bottom of the text, you see what proportion of your text is underlined. So that gives you quite an intuitive method of giving a number to how much text reuse there is in a particular text. And it turns out that in this sense, for the preach-in and hand corpus, there is a lot of text reuse overall throughout the corpus. You would get a rate of about 40%, which I think is very high. And as you'd expect, there are some texts which have unusually high rates of text reuse. So particularly texts which are often thought of as compilations, or which primarily include text that appears elsewhere, like the Kongzi Jiayu or the Qianhanji. Also things like the Shiji, where a lot of the content is reproduced both in other places in the Shiji and also in places like the Hanshu, as well as widely cited texts like the Lenyu, and texts which intentionally reuse the same structures over and over, like the Shijing. And of course this goes down to the other end of the spectrum. There are texts with virtually no reuse across the corpus, so very few parallels to anything else. So as I said, one kind of reuse you get is within the text, a single text repeating itself in different places or reusing the same structure in a very clearly related way. And so if we quantify text reuse in this way, we can also put numbers on claims like such and such is a repetitive text or a formulaic text. And again, you see quite a lot of variation. Some of the highest scoring texts on this metric are ones which contain repetitive phrasing or repeat the same passage over again. Also things like the Mozi, where effectively the same story is retold almost in exactly the same wording in different chapters of the text. And at the other end, you get down to texts with virtually no internal reuse, or the Jizhoupian, which in fact has none at all. So the last thing I want to talk about, which is very closely related to what Song Tun has been telling us about, is text reuse as a network. So as I was saying, this is now, once we can look at text reuse between any two texts, this is really a relational picture, and so we can visualize this as a network, where we think of this as a weighted network graph, and the weights, so the strength of the connection between different nodes, is proportional to the amount of the two texts which belong to one of these parallel groups. And we can simplify the picture in various ways, so by excluding pairs which have very little reuse, and we can do exactly the sort of clustering which Song Tun has already shown us how to do. And in fact, the visualizations I'm going to show you were also made in Gephi, so this is something everyone now knows how to do, which is great. So this is the kind of picture that you get for the preach-in and hand corpus doing this kind of network analysis. So this is laid out entirely on the basis of relative strengths of parallels according to this kind of procedure. And if you look at this graph in detail, there are some interesting things that you can notice, particularly around the edges of it, in terms of the way texts have been clustered just on the basis of parallels. So the first obvious thing, which is maybe the least interesting, the least surprising, is that the commentaries to the Chuncho are all grouped together. That's not at all surprising because they're all commentaries on the same text, essentially. So of course they have high levels of reuse. But you also see more surprising things, like all of the dictionary-like works from the preach-in and hand also form a cluster, and a fairly outlying cluster, relatively more connected to themselves than to anything else. The same is true for the medical texts, which are very clearly outlying cluster. Mathematical works also. And the military texts, or texts on warfare relating to military strategy, again, form a separate cluster. And depending on to what extent you want to put your own interpretation on this picture, and I think Song Tun was definitely correct to warn us that that's quite a risky thing to do, you can certainly see other trends within this picture. So for example, the Taoist texts tend to be clustered at the bottom right. The legalist texts tend to be clustered over here. Now these are, I think, these blue circles in particular are really putting our own interpretation on this rather than something that comes clearly out of the graph. But similarly, you can see the histories also cluster in a fairly localized area. So the last thing I want to show briefly is what happens if we perform something which I think Song-Chun also told us about, which is a community analysis, an automated community analysis algorithm applied to this kind of network. And if you do that, you actually find that at least for some of these groups, you get results which cohere quite clearly, quite closely to the standard groupings for some of these texts. So if I overlay the circles from the last slides, you see that even according to this algorithm, purely on the basis of text reuse, the dictionary-like works, the medical texts, and the mathematical works form communities just based on this network analysis. So as you can see, this is a very complicated graph, and there's a lot left to be said and a lot more detailed analysis that would be needed to say nothing else, particularly about the very closely interconnected sort of mainstream set of texts in the middle, which it's very difficult to say anything on the basis of just this picture. But hopefully this gives some sort of evidence to the idea that text reuse may have some applications in terms of classifying texts, and hopefully gives a demonstration of how some seemingly fairly straightforward and easy to understand methods of analyzing text on a small scale can actually lead to fairly surprising results when you start looking at them on a larger scale and when you start doing network analysis. Okay, I'll stop there. But if you want to look at the actual small-scale analysis for these parallel passages, all of it's available online. Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you, Alan.